Hi everyone, it's Emma, first year medical student here for part 2 on how I take and use my notes in med school. So if you missed part 1, make sure you go check it out somewhere up here and go watch that first, because that video is all about how I take notes on my iPad and how I use those notes to make summary notes from the lecture information. This video is all going to be about how I use those notes, those consolidated study notes, and actually study with them to further enhance the learning that's already happened. So if you're interested in seeing that, then let's jump into it. So last video I showed you how I take notes from my iPad, and I eventually end up with something more like this, a nice summary written on a computer that is nice and neat and easy to read. So the next step is actually reviewing from that information. For the review, I use my printed notes as well as any other materials that I have, so extra readings or Googles and things like that I use, and I will need pens, highlighters, sticky notes, all of those sort of stationary things that all of us nerd out about. So I sit down with the study notes and I start to reread them and I start to annotate them. So I will end up with, I don't know if you can see, highlighted bits. I'm still working on a color coding system, but you know, just even highlighting key terms right now works. And I will, let's see here, I will annotate extra notes, so things from other sources or past lectures now that I can add to this, or you know, keynotes of you only need to know this part of here, that kind of thing. Yeah, and you can see again, there's diagrams included, and then I will highlight the key points or things that I'm having trouble memorizing or learning. And I will end up with notes that are much more colorful and much more annotated, but again, that extra step of reviewing them helps me see where I'm missing. And again, after that review, or even before, if I have time, before that, you know, an extra review, I will look back at that question list that we created in step 1, and I will try to answer those questions again, and I'll try to look at the learning outcomes and use the learning outcomes as sort of like a brain dump stimulator to put in all the information I have before review, and then put in all the information I have after review. So again, we're constantly actively recalling and actively interacting with the material. It's not just reading and memorizing. Now, step 4 is consolidation, and that's where the notes that I have that are all now pretty and colorful end up in cue cards or mind maps or charts. And I'll try to splice in some images of what I'm talking about as I talk about it. But again, I will go back through those review notes that I have that now have annotations and color coding, and I will start to try to create pathways or relationships and put those into some sort of visual form. I am sometimes a visual learner, but it's also just this forcing yourself to take the information from one form of text or audio or visual and turning it into something else really forces you to understand it well. So I made a diagram of the GI track and started writing down information about each section, so where things were absorbed, what kind of tissues were present, that kind of thing. I had a chart for all of the different respiratory illnesses and what breath sounds would be expected, or sounds of percussion, what kind of x-ray findings you'd have. So you're building relationships between different disease states or different pathologies as well as different healthy states, and you're putting those in terms of each other, so you're not just rote memorizing. Cue cards, they are a memorization tool, so I try to stay away from them, but they work really well for pharmacology as well as some micro. So I did have cue cards, and it would just be a drug name, and the back would be what is the drug, what does it do, how do you use it, that kind of thing. So this consolidation is messy. You know, I use a sketchbook for my mind maps and things, and then I use cue cards and markers and all these things. I really spread out. If you've watched my vlogs that I study in, you'll notice I make a mess, but this is where you really get to test how much you learn. And, you know, again, pull out those questions, pull out more questions from friends, and start seeing if this consolidation has helped, and quiz yourself along the way. So again, you're actively interacting with the material. And I want to emphasize, as I'm looking at this to try to find you examples, that it's not always the prettiest. So you can't even, you can see there, my writing isn't perfect. It doesn't have to be. My drawings could probably be a bit better, but it's all about whether or not you understand it. So I was really cautious to do mind maps because I don't necessarily have the nicest handwriting and I don't know if it's going to turn out well or be mapped out well, but that doesn't matter. What matters is if you understand it and it works for your brain and you're able to visualize that again or recreate that in a test situation. So if it's not the prettiest, who cares? But see here, the nerve regulation of breathing, all sorts of things. Some of them are just, I wrote little stories to myself to explain pathways. The consolidation is really up to you and what works in your brain for that kind of material. In medicine, you're going to come across things that can be summarized in charts, by words, by diagrams, and you need to figure out what works best for you. For me, that's kind of a mixed methods. Sometimes it's cue cards, sometimes it's written stories, and sometimes it's diagram, as you could see. So try things out and see what works for you. So talking about timelines, if you've watched part 1, then you know I take my notes in class, obviously. Try to do the summary notes on the computer as soon as possible, latest by the end of that week. And then I can start doing the review maybe the next week or a week later, and the consolidating happening. Goals is it's happening more than a week before the exam, but it may be happening just a week before the exam as I try to work through all of the different blocks and lectures that we have. One tip I do have, obviously it's good to study things in our blocks, so I studied all the respiratory stuff together, all the GI and all of the renal urogenital after our mid-semester, but it was also good to shake it up, so I wasn't always reviewing resp, GI, renal. I would sometimes kind of jump around. It keeps you fresh on your toes, and it also is how it's going to come to you in an exam. It won't necessarily be organized as, here's all your respiratory questions, now you can shift into GI. They get mixed up, and you do multiple choice and short answer, so it's good to not get into too much of a routine, but obviously don't jump necessarily from respiratory medications to renal carcinoma. Like, that's not going to help you build connections, but don't always necessarily follow the same trend. You'll find that you kind of sit on your haunches and start to think, oh yeah, I know all the renal stuff because you've been studying all day. So the next day, start with the renal stuff and go the other direction, if that makes sense. So that's how I take my notes from iPad in lecture all the way to pretty colorful stories and diagrams. And if you've watched part 1 and part 2, then you know my whole system, and I hope it's helped you kind of get an idea of a way to study in med school. And I really want to emphasize that this is just one way. This is just how I do it, and I'm likely going to change because this is just first year, first semester. But I wanted to share some ideas with you. Try them out for yourself and see how they go, and don't be afraid to edit your own style. Everyone studies differently. But if you have any questions or want to suggest another topic, comment it down below. Make sure you subscribe because I have more videos like this that I want to create for all of you. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.